I'm not sure if you heard the news this week or not, but Wednesday morning, the Reverend Billy Graham changed his permanent address at the age of 99. He once said, "Someday you will hear or read that Billy Graham is dead. Don't you believe a word of it. I shall be more alive than I am now. I will have just changed my address. I will have gone into the presence of God." Amen. What a beautiful epitaph that is it not? We got a special video. We have a special star celebrity this morning that we want to start out with. So would you just give us our attention this morning here?
Hi, I'm Carol Gregory, and I am Church 247. Good morning. I'm Carol Gregory, and this is my testimony. I was saved as a child at Bible school. I've gone to church all my life. As a child, my mother always spent Sunday afternoons reading to my sister and me Bible stories. She was a single mom. My father left us when my sister and I were toddlers. When I prayed at night, I pictured God. I always saw him sitting in a velvet Queen Anne chair. I'd never seen one at that time, so I don't know how I came up with that. He was always facing a lovely, comforting fireplace. I couldn't see his face for the wing of the chair, but as I talked to him, he would slip his arm over the side of the chair and hold my hand. It was always the most safe, comforting feeling. I've always felt God in my life, sometimes more strongly than others. I've done many different kinds of work in church and enjoyed it. Later on, after I became a nurse in my late 30s, I didn't have as much time to devote as my church, as I had become a single mother also. My husband died when he was 32 years old. Our children were 11, 9, and 2. That 2-year-old became Coral's mother 28 years later. God gave me a real heart for single mothers, from raising my 3 precious children, and from my mom raising us. I'll tell you more in a few minutes about how that fits into God's plan for my life. I became even closer to God as a hospice nurse. I found I liked being close to people who were going to be close to Jesus soon. I believe other than being a mother to my children, God sent me here to be a hospice nurse. Many times God sent me to see a patient or a family with a specific message for them. I never knew when I was on my way there, but I always knew on the way home that God had used me according to his plans. There is nothing more joyful than knowing that you are doing what God sent you here to do. I started attending Church 247 a couple of months after it started. Last year, around this time, the devil just got hold of me. I stopped attending church. I couldn't seem to get started to another church because I know now that God meant me to be here. In late October, I found out I needed open heart surgery, and one of my first thoughts was to get in touch with Hope and ask if Clay and the elders would come and pray with me. They blessed me by coming the night before my surgery. They laid hands on me and cried out to God on my behalf. It was one of the most uplifting experiences of my life. I felt power flow into me. I knew God still had work for me to do here. Amen. And that brings me back to the single moms. I believe that what I experienced as a single mom shows me that moms have the weight of the world on their shoulders. I believe the support of a loving church for them and their children would be a blessing from God. I spoke with Clay about this recently, one Tuesday night in his study. With his blessing, and I hope the blessing of this church, we will begin a ministry for single moms. We'll meet once a month beginning soon. It'll be a time to talk about whatever they're struggling with at the moment. And believe me, they're struggling all the time. We'll arrange child care for this meeting. If you have any interest in being involved in this ministry in any way, please let me or Hope or Clay know. I believe I'm going where God is leading. It won't be a success, though, without you and your prayers. Thank you.
Amen.
Musicians come up, that's pretty strong, isn't it? Thank you, Miss Carol, for your testimony. Thank you for your life. Thank you for what you're about to bring to our church, not only through a ministry to single moms, but we're going to have Miss Carol, we'll hear more from her about the ministry that she had. She retired as a hospice nurse. Did you love that line? I love being close to people who are going to be close to Jesus real soon. What an incredible line. What a great story. What a great testimony. Thank you for that. Thank you for Josh. I know that other folks have testimonies that you'd like to share. Maybe you don't want to stand up here with a microphone in your hand, but Josh has a pretty good little setup right now. Chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar tells the three Hebrew children, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you've got to bow down and worship. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer to this. If the God we serve exists, then He can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and He can rescue us from the power of you, the king. Verse 18, but even if.
That's right.
Even if He does not rescue us, we want you as king to know that we'll just not worship your gods or worship the gold statue that you set up. What a great picture of faith. Even if God doesn't answer the prayer like I hope or like I wish, even if, I will trust Him. We're in Acts chapter 16 again this morning. I would like to give us one thought by way of review from the last couple of weeks. You know what it is? Paul is still grieving the parting of ways with his friend Barnabas. Maybe when we get finished studying Revelation in a few years, I'll stop mentioning that every Sunday. And then one other little hidden nugget from the passage last week that I left uncovered so we could focus on God's will, and that is this. I may have that slide. They, them, they, we, us, we. Chapter 6 from last week. Do I have that? Verse 6 from chapter 16. They went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia and were prevented by the Holy Spirit from speaking the message in Asia. When they came to Mysia, they tried to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So bypassing Mysia, they came down to Troas. And then verse 10, where we ended last week. After Paul, had seen the vision, we immediately made efforts to set out for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to evangelize them. Verse 11 from today, then setting sail from Troas, we ran a straight course to Samothrace. After 16 chapters of Dr. Luke writing the story, writing the narrative in the third person, he, they, them, nonchalantly in chapter 16, he just slides himself into the narrative for the first time. We found ourselves on the way to Samothrace. After Paul had seen the vision, we made efforts to set out for Macedonia. An amazing, beautiful, just little piece of writing, a beautiful way of just himself, slipping himself into the narrative. And we see about 5 different we passages, and we'll point those out as we go through the book of Acts. Dr. Luke, this physician, on this day down in Troas for the first time, joined Paul and Silas and Timothy in the narrative. Lots of opinion about where Luke, for the physician, was from. Possibly Philippi, which is the city that we'll talk about today. Maybe Paul met Dr. Luke at Troas. Remember, that's where we ended last week, right on the coast of Troas. Paul had traveled west as far as he could travel, and he was now stopped and had to go somewhere, and he was waiting for what was next in the picture. Possibly, but here in Troas is where Dr. Luke met Paul. But perhaps they had an instant connection, and that night Paul had a vision about some place named Philippi over in Macedonia after a conversation with Dr. Luke. I don't know. We don't know, but apparently after the long journey away from home that we talked about last week, after the long journey with very little direction, except for closed doors, Paul got new directions. Later, Paul would write to the church at Corinth. I think I have this verse up there. Later, he said, when I came to Troas to preach the gospel, the Lord opened up a door for me. We talked last week about finding God's will and how sometimes we feel like we're aimlessly wandering about, and then at the right time when we're at Troas, when the land runs out and something has to happen, God opens a door for us. An open door to preach the gospel. 2,000 years ago, the Apostle Paul searched and found an open door. For the past 60 years, the Reverend Billy Graham has done the same thing. Perhaps the evangelist who spoke to more people than any other person in human history about the simple message of the gospel of Jesus. Both in person and through the medium of television, I've read reports, as perhaps you have, that as many as 215 million people have heard the message from Reverend Billy Graham, beginning in 1947 and preaching his last sermon next Saturday at his funeral in 2018. But the startling reality for me is that the foundation, the model, the predecessor of Reverend Billy Graham's message was the Apostle Paul. Not the least of which were Paul's missionary journeys reminiscent of the crusades that were led by Billy Graham. I've got a picture I found here of Paul and Billy. Not together, perhaps, you understand. Pictures of both of them preaching to crowds indelibly etched in our minds. As you may have, I read this week about the crusade in New York City. An article on the Gospel Coalition website tells us that it was originally scheduled to run for 6 weeks. The campaign at the Madison Square Garden in New York City was extended 3 times. It started on May 15th, 1957, and closed on September 1st, Labor Day Eve, 16 weeks later. A 16-week televised evangelistic crusade that ended with an estimated 125,000 people on the streets of Madison Square. The message? The same identical, simple message that the Apostle Paul preached in towns like Antioch and Iconium and Troas, and in today's message, Philippi. An appropriate tribute to the life and ministry of the Reverend Billy Graham necessarily, in my opinion, involves a similar tribute to God's missionary to the Gentiles, the Apostle Paul himself. Remarkably, today's passage in Acts chapter 16 provides a beautiful tribute to both the Apostle Paul and to the Reverend Billy Graham, and it identifies some amazing similarities between them, between these two men, each in their own generation. So join with me, if you will, in verse 11 of Acts chapter 16. Paul and Silas and Timothy and the good Dr. Luke, with new clarity and new direction and new purpose and new energy, the next leg on the journey, a crusade in Philippi. Verse 11 tells us, then, setting sail from Troas, we ran a straight course to Samothrace, the next day to Neapolis. Now I've got a map here that is a different map than I've been showing, because our big map does not show very well this island of Samothrace out in the middle of the Aegean Sea that Paul and the fellows would have to pass through on their way to Neapolis, which is the port at which they landed. If we look at the bigger map then, you do see just up there at the top, you do see just a little jut from a straight course over to Neapolis, where they went through the little island of Samothrace. We ran a straight course. It's not a perfectly straight course, but the phrase, we ran a straight course, is a nautical phrase that you use when you're driving boats, or whatever you do with boats. The phrase meant specifically, the wind was at our back. We did not have to zigzag back and forth with the sails to get from where we were over to Samothrace. We had the wind right at our back, and we were pushing ahead Life isn't always like that, but can I just say that I pray that for you, that the wind would be at your back. That was no doubt in the mind of the person who wrote that old Irish blessing, may the road rise to meet you. May the wind always be at your back, pushing you ahead. May the sun shine warm on your face and rains fall soft upon your fields, and until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand. They spent weeks or months getting to Troas with unclear direction, but now in 2 days they were in Europe. Verse 12 tells us from there, or Neapolis, they went to Philippi. So they ported at Neapolis, got off the boat, and walked a day's journey to Philippi. From there to Philippi, a Roman colony, which is a leading city of that district of Macedonia. We stayed in that city for a number of days. They landed at Neapolis, and then they went to Philippi. Interestingly, up until this point, Dr. Luke doesn't give us any background about any of the cities. He said, we traveled through Derbe, we traveled through Iconium, we traveled through Lystra. No background, but when he comes to the city of Philippi, he stops and gives the listener or the recipient of this message a little bit of background. Theophilus, you may remember in Acts chapter 1, that is who Dr. Luke was writing this letter, this narrative for originally. Theophilus probably knew about Derbe and Lystra and Iconium and Phrygia and Galatia, but he probably knew less, perhaps nothing, about this little town of Philippi, which was in the continent of Europe. Why were they directed to, or why did they land in, or how did they wind up in Philippi? Maybe it was a connection with Dr. Luke. If Luke was actually from Philippi, even though they met in Troas, some scholars say that Dr. Luke was from Philippi. If so, then he would have been in Troas either on business or on pleasure when he ran into the Apostle Paul. Maybe since Philippi was a Roman colony, that the primary language was Greek. Because remember, Paul spoke in Greek and or Hebrew because he was a Jew. And he got to this little town of Macedonia, Neapolis, they may not have spoke very much Greek. But this town of Philippi, a leading city, a Roman colony, perhaps that's the reason they ended up in Philippi. Maybe that was a specific part of the vision that Paul had. God, the angel didn't just tell him to go to Macedonia. Perhaps he said go straight to Philippi. I don't know why Philippi. It was a leading city in the district of Macedonia, in that particular district. Not the capital city like Columbia, but a leading city like Spartanburg. Plowing unplowed ground. Navigating uncharted territory. Going where others dared not go or had not been, believing God with shameless audacity to do the impossible. Here's an excerpt from the article in the current online edition of Christianity Today. Few, if any, developments in Billy Graham's ministry have been more surprising or controversial than his success in penetrating the Iron Curtain. Beginning in 1978, virtually every Soviet-controlled country progressively gave Billy Graham privileges that no other churchman, including the most prominent and politically docile native religious leaders, had ever received. Graham used these visits to preach, to encourage believers, and to explain to communist leaders that the restrictions of religious freedom was counterproductive, hampering diplomatic relations with America. Unafraid to navigate uncharted waters, simply believing that the gospel of Jesus could change a culture, Paul and Billy had that in common. Go with me to verse 13. On the Sabbath day, we went outside the city gate by the river where we thought there was a place of prayer. We sat down and spoke to the women there. What an incredibly loaded verse of Scripture this is. Would you follow these 4 observations with me? Observation number 1, the Sabbath day was treated differently than the other days of the week. Remember the New Testament church beginning in Jerusalem, they went on to meet on the first day of the week, which is Sunday, which is the day of the week that we meet now. But here in Philippi, there wasn't a church yet. So these folks were still obeying the 4th commandment of the Big Ten. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy, separate, different. May I offer you this bold challenge? The people of faith today can significantly impact our culture by treating one day of the week differently.
That's right.
Sabbath day was a day of rest, and it was a day of worship, and it was a day of prayer. We can talk about impacting our culture. You want a very specific and practical way of making that happen? Set aside one day of the week for rest and worship and prayer. Perhaps not deep or profound, but it's culture changing. But I thought that keeping the Sabbath was an Old Testament teaching. It was, but so was thou shalt not kill. And our culture would benefit from that one today, would they not? And thou shalt not steal, and thou shalt not commit adultery, and thou shalt have no other gods before me. Let me summarize. On the holy day, the set-aside day, the different day, these folks stopped what they were doing and they worshiped on the Sabbath day. Observation number 2 in the form of a question. So if resting on the Sabbath was a Jewish thing, why were they doing it up there in Macedonia? Good question. This statement clearly indicates that there were Jewish folks living in Philippi. If we saw the map, the Jews primarily lived down in Israel. How did they get all the way over to Philippi and other places? The short answer is through multiple exiles and dispersions, beginning as early as 722 BC, all the way up until the birth of Christ. Jews were dispersed from the homeland in what has collectively become known as the diaspora, or the Great Dispersion. Why did God allow or cause this dispersion of the Jews from their homeland to all the regions of the world? It was no doubt to put people of faith in place ahead of the arrival of the gospel. Unbeknownst to them, they were simply doing prep work. These Jews carried with them the monotheistic belief that there was one true God. You remember, all the regions we've talked about around that, they were polytheistic. They believed in many gods. But the Jews believed that there was one God. God took His people and spread them out all over the place in preparation, in advance for the coming of the gospel with the Apostle Paul. They worshiped the God of the Bible. They didn't have full understanding. They didn't have the message of the gospel of Jesus yet, but they knew enough to stop on the Sabbath and gather to pray. This wasn't their first Sabbath meeting to pray. Perhaps they'd been doing it for years or decades, praying for God to visit them. Perhaps not sure exactly how or what to pray for, but they just prayed. Another article on crossmap.com shares this. For many years, Sterling Houston directed Mr. Graham's crusades in the USA and Canada. In his book, Crusade Evangelism and the Local Church, Sterling Houston states, prayer is the first priority in evangelism. People, methods, and materials are instruments, and it is only through prayer that these instruments become effective by the empowering of the Holy Spirit. Mr. Graham often said, when I am asked to list the most important steps for an evangelistic mission, my reply is always the same. Prayer. 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 He goes on to say, in addition, prayer groups were organized in the business, academic, medical, industrial, and various other communities throughout the city. This is not Paul talking. This is not Acts. This is this man talking about the Billy Graham crusades in advance of those crusades. Not only encouraging prayer for the crusade preparations, but that the church would be revived and hearts be prepared to respond favorably to the preaching of the good news. And every effort was taken to open a prayer home on every residential block to bring together those who worked at home. The above meetings were coordinated with a prayer time broadcast heard over a local radio station. Perhaps you were part of one of those prayer meetings in your home or heard those broadcasts over the local radio station in advance in preparation for a Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. Our church is working through the Draw the Circle book. It is not so we can check off our list that we studied a book on prayer together as our church. That is not the purpose of going through the book. It is so that our entire perspective about our lives and our culture revolves around, that our culture revolves around and is consumed by this single truth that we desperately need a great movement of God that is born out of and bathed in the spiritual discipline of prayer. A movement in our culture today. That's why we're going through the book, Draw the Circle, so that we begin to practice and to believe God for great things in our own lives and in the lives of our culture. Observation number 3, also in the form of a question, well, why didn't they just meet at the synagogue to pray? Why did they go down by the river? Another good question. Other sources say this. The Holman Christian Standard Bible summarizes, Philippi apparently did not have a synagogue, since only women and no men are mentioned. The establishment of a synagogue required the participation of at least 10 Jewish men. You can do some easy research and find that in many different sources. Apparently there were not 10 men together in Philippi who were Jewish men to start a synagogue. No synagogue. Imagine no place of worship. Church 247. 247. So named because there were already 246 churches in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Spartanburg County of South Carolina. You probably passed a half a dozen of those churches on your way here this morning. But Philippi, Macedonia, in roughly AD 50, 0 places of worship of the true God. So what do? Verse 12 told us that they hung out in the city for a number of days. They showed up and got there early and hung around and met some people and built some relationships and perhaps a network and found out, are there any believers here? Are there any Jews here? Are there any folks that worship God? Well, yeah, I think there's a bunch of ladies that get down there on Saturday and they get together and pray. Bingo, that's us. That's where we'll be. Scouting perhaps, asking around. PowerPoint observation number 4. The final observation about verse 13. Kudos to the women. We sat down and spoke to the women that were gathered there. Many of us have known and seen and experienced the women often leading the charge in all things spiritual. Now just get a head nod. Have you seen that happen? Ladies, thank you for your keen sense of the presence of God in your lives. Thank you for the keen presence. Thank you for your prayers on behalf of our families. Mom, thank you for praying for me. Thank you, ladies. Kudos to you for meeting together to pray. And, not but and, may I further say that of all the things that have happened in our lives at Church 247 over these past 3 years, I am as thrilled and moved and humbled and excited that we have godly men at our church, serving our church and leading the charge. I am as excited about that as anything that I see happening. And so may I add my personal observation 4B. Thank you to the men. Ladies, you're probably as excited about that as I am, aren't you? Having the men come along beside us and step up into places of leadership. According to Wikipedia, that great theological source, the first Billy Graham evangelistic campaign held September 13 through 21, 1947 in the Civic Auditorium. Not in a church, not in a synagogue, in a civic auditorium in Grand Rapids, Michigan, was attended by 6,000 people. Billy would rent a large venue, such as a stadium or a park or a street. Setting up shop and bringing the gospel to the marketplace, Paul and Billy both had that in common. I will say that it is uncanny to me the number of folks that have mentioned and talked about and discussed and have begun praying about our church holding a tent revival. Somewhere up and down the street, out there in the middle of the marketplace. Verse 14. The first part of the verse is that a woman named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth from the city of Thyatira who worshiped God, was listening. She was named Lydia. Perhaps that was a nickname because the city of Thyatira was in the region of Lydia. So it'd be like me saying, calling Hans Hans, it'd be like calling him, hey, Spartanburger. Say that perhaps Lydia was a nickname for her because she was from the region of Lydia. May I show you that on the map? Interesting that the city of Lydia was down here, the city of Thyatira was in the area of the region of Lydia, which you may remember and notice from last week. It is down in the region of Asia. Remember, I told you last week that Dr. Swindoll's map has Asia right down here, and this map does not have Asia down here, but they tried to turn south to Asia, and they were prevented from doing so. Can I just let you look at this map for a second and look at the cities that are on that map and remind you of John, John the Revelator in Revelation. When he started the book, he wrote letters to 7 churches. Do you remember that? The 7 churches that he wrote to were Ephesus, Smyrna, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, Pergamum. All of those 7 churches in those 7 towns, they were down in Asia. God had not forgotten about Asia. God would reach out and His gospel would penetrate this area of Asia. But from last week, it just wasn't time. It just wasn't time yet. Eventually, the gospel would make it down into Asia, and one of those cities was Thyatira in the region of Lydia, where Miss Lydia was from, who was up there in Philippi doing her business. The point of that, although his second journey, Paul was prevented from going to the region down in Asia, God made sure that this region received the gospel. She was a dealer in purple, the Bible told us in verse 14. Purple, you may remember, was the color of royalty. Lydia's business was in fine cloth. Her appeal was to the well-to-do. Dr. Luke specifically mentions this, probably because Lydia was a prominent and successful businesswoman there in the town of Philippi. And then it says that Lydia worshiped God. Maybe she was a convert to the Jewish faith. Maybe she was there on the Sabbath for the purpose of praying. But verse 14 almost sounds to me like that on this Sabbath day, which was just an ordinary day for the non-Jews, all the non-Jews were just doing their business on the Sabbath. There was nothing special about the Sabbath for them. Perhaps she was out in the open air market like you've seen if you've been to any European countries or towns or cities. She was out in the open air market on the Sabbath day selling purple fabric from her kiosk. But she just set her kiosk up close enough where the ladies that prayed every week, she could be close enough to the action. So on this day, she happened to overhear Paul preaching. Let me read it again. A woman named Lydia, a dealer in purple from the city of Thyatira, who worshiped God, was listening. Maybe she was carrying on her business, but she had an ear over to what was going on with these ladies praying and some guy from out of town who started preaching. Whether she was there for the purpose of praying or just wanted to be close to the action, look what happened at the end of verse 14. The Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was spoken by Paul. We've seen that over and over and over, haven't we? The simple message of the gospel takes root. Why? Because the Lord opened her heart. We've said it over and over and over. Throwing seeds up in the air, that's our business. Opening hearts, that's God's business. If we're faithful to throw seeds up in the air, if we're faithful to just spread the message, God will be faithful to open the hearts. What a liberating truth for me. I don't have to try to get anybody to become a Christian. I can just throw seeds up in the air and the Lord will do His work. Throwing seeds. In the same Christianity Today article, Billy Graham is quoted as saying, when God gets ready to shake America, he may not take the PhD and the Doctor of Divinity. God may choose a country boy. And I pray that he would. End of quote. Sharing the gospel with whoever would listen with the belief that God would open someone's heart. Paul and Billy had that in common. Verse 15, the last verse, tells us, after she and her husband were baptized, she urged us, first person, Luke is saying, first person plural. After she and her husband, her household were baptized, she urged us, if you consider me a believer in the Lord, would you please come and stay at my house? And she persuaded us. Lydia got the goods that day when she trusted Jesus. Then she immediately went home and told whoever was in her house. Some of the commentary says that means she probably wasn't married. I don't know where they get that. She was married or not married and had children or not children and grandparents, and I don't know who was there, but she went home and told the house and the whole household. How good was it for Lydia? It was good enough that her and her whole household had gone down by the river to pray. Now they were going down by the river to get baptized. If you had walked the aisle to trust Jesus Christ as your personal Savior at a Billy Graham crusade, you would have been given in your hand a packet of information before you left. I don't know if anybody is a witness. And in that packet, you would have been encouraged to get baptized as the very first next step in your spiritual journey. I want to announce to you today that we are going to have a baptismal service on Easter Sunday immediately after church. Remember that baptism is a picture of us identifying with the death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Baptism on Easter Sunday, now that's a great way to go down to it. Immediately after Lydia went home and told her family, and they all trusted the message, and they all went down to the river to pray and to get baptized, immediately after that, Lydia began contributing to the spiritual community by exercising her own giftedness. Now, I don't know if before this event Lydia knew it or not, but on that day, Lydia realized, I have the gift of hospitality. And I want to begin opening my home up to somebody. Hey, Dr. Luke and Paul and Timothy and Silas and all the people, would you come down to my house? Because I want to give back. I want to share and contribute. Lydia didn't wait until she felt qualified. She didn't wait for someone to ask her to do something. She immediately began to give back. Dr. Luke closes this section by saying very matter-of-factly, and she persuaded us. I imagine Paul and his cohorts could not have been happier than to be over 1,000 miles away from home and now on a completely different continent. And some lady with the gift of hospitality says, hey, will you come with us? Paul and Dr. Luke Price said, absolutely. What's for lunch? We can't wait to get there. Apparently Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke set up shop for some time here in Philippi. Last week they weren't sure where they were going. And now, just a few days later, they found themselves in the middle of an old-fashioned revival.
Amen.
To them, it wasn't an old-fashioned revival. It was a new-fashioned revival because they were setting the standard. How long would this revival last? As long as God's Spirit was still changing lives. Maybe 16 weeks, like happened up in New York City in 1957. Paul and Billy had that in common. You know, you've heard me say 1,000 times, I've often said I wanted to be the next Billy Graham. Now's my chance. I need to act fast. One more quote from Christianity Today, an article. Indeed, it is plausible that the answer to the often asked question, who will be the next Billy Graham? It's plausible that the answer to that question is not a single man or a woman, but this mighty army of anonymous individuals whose spirits have been thrilled by Billy Graham's example and their hearts set on fire by his ringing exhortation, do the work of an evangelist. beautiful truth about sharing the gospel of Jesus. I'm not being held accountable for the results. I've only been asked to be faithful.
That's right.
Hope sent me a text this morning. I was upstairs studying, and she sent me a text, and it said, Daddy's been dead 20 years today. For 40 years, Hope's dad pastored. I hope that's my next picture. There he is, Reverend Clyde Nations, joining the groups of the people who have been faithful to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. For 40 years, Hope's dad pastored. I was there the day of his funeral. There were not people up on overpasses sharing their respects. There was no glamour. There was no news coverage. But I would offer to you that faithful men and women have served faithfully at their post for hundreds of years. Hope said that her daddy had the privilege of taking all 5 of his kids down to the river to pray and to dip their toes in the water that bathes you clean from head to foot. What does that look like for us? I pray for Church 247 that it looks something like this. Once in a while we'll have a children's sermon, but it just hit me this morning that I don't think we have a single picture taken of what's happened in the other part of our building. Sunday after Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. There's some faithful ladies and men over there who are very simply, faithfully sharing the message of the gospel of Jesus with our kids.
Amen.
Yeah.
How about this one? How about the testimony of a person whose life was changed that looks like 15 years ago, like he was a young man? How about the testimony of a young man sharing? I'm pretty sure that picture was made the day that I was of my ordination here at church at the other building. And I hadn't asked Israel if he would speak. I had some folks to speak, and Joe was there remarkably and spoke on that day. And when we almost got done, Israel said, I've got to share something. And he came up and he shared the testimony of a changed life.
Yeah.
How about this one? Jesus said, allow the little children to come to me. Man, I love those pictures of us loving on our children. Maybe this one. Maybe the kids up here ministering to us. What an incredible sight that is. How about this one? Maybe it's out in the marketplace. Maybe some lady sitting beside Easter Bunny on a bench out by a pond and shares the gospel of Jesus with a bunch of our children. I hope that's what it looks like. I hope that's what it looks like for us to carry on the torch. How about this one? How about our opportunity to go down to the river to pray and to dip the toes in the water of somebody who gets washed from head to toe? How about this last one? We have a beautiful place here in which to sow and in which to gather. Gather 247. May God use this place and our lives to see a great harvest gathered for His kingdom. For many years, Reverend Graham wrote in a column named My Answers. Before his death, Billy Graham approved the following response as his final My Answer column. And this is the final paragraph from the final column. Billy Graham says, and I quote, I won't be in heaven because I've preached to large crowds or because I've tried to live a good life. I'll be in heaven for one reason. Many years ago, I put my faith and trust in Jesus Christ, who died on the cross to make our forgiveness possible and rose again from the dead to give us eternal life. And then he says, do you know that you will go to heaven when you die? You can by committing your life to Jesus Christ today. End of quote.